First of all, good evening, everyone. I know that you are guys waiting for pizza and waiting to get home because we are quite late. So I'm going to be rather in a rush and try to sum up everything that I sum up here as an experience in this kind of slides for a thing that I did really recently, which is I was just searching for an employer and for a new job. And on my former employer, I was able to learn a little bit about strategical design, tactical design, so on and on. And I wanted to reflect the technical tests that my potential employer would ask me to do, to reflect those terms about DDD, maybe CQRS, and sourcing without trying not to show up too much. And that's the optical pistol, which it's just summing up the title, which is tackling the technical test as the main problem. That's it. Well, a little bit about me. Sorry for being in front of the screen. Well, my name is Eduard Simón. Since exactly today, I'm a senior backend at Atrapalo. Atrapalo is a online tour agency. Sorry, it's been in the market for 18 years. There's 200 people working there, and since more or less the last maybe 5-6 years, they are becoming quite famous on doing things great, doing things more or less on a higher level, applying DDD, applying a bit of good practices, and I was rather interested because lots of former colleagues that I had just worked there, and I just got a chance to work with them and said, why not? And I just learned it today. I was former backend and was a at Wonga, where that's the place where I learned more or less the stuff that I'm going to show you. I'm being a developer in various companies for up to maybe 7-8 years, but I'm being a rather domain-driven design, CQRS, even searching learner, and I want to revert testing about learner since a year and a half. So guys, you might just get an idea of how it's going to be developed itself. I mean, it's not going to be very abstract. There's going to be implementation examples in PHP, something really simple and something that you could maybe see and correct me upon. That's it. Oh, this is my rather new website. You can just check it out if you want to see the things that I write sometimes. Again, this is a sum up of what I just did, and I said a moment ago. This is not a talk about reactive modeling, functional programming, command and query responsibility separation, event sourcing, and complex integrations about messages, RabbitMQ, context mappings. I mean, if you're searching this in this talk, this might not be the talk for you. I'm going to be boiling down really very basic concepts of 3D, and this is just about the way to approach problems, so using very basic concepts of domain-driven design. An attempt, and this is what the real point of the talk is, an attempt to see indications of an inquiry, and when I say inquiry, I mean an asking official from business on your everyday work or even on a technical test, and disguising them as terms that appear in domain-driven design, defined by services, value objects, entities, aggregates, sagas, and patterns. And of course, I mean, this is a chance for me and for you guys to spot things that were badly wrong on my implementation, which might be wrong, the reason why I didn't get the job on my first potential employee in the first place. So, and last but not least, it's my first talk at all. I mean, just be gentle, I'm just learning. Okay, I'm going to talk about a rather real example that I had from an interview that I had for a media company, which handed me over a technical test with lots of terms and lots of domain concepts. And since my intention was to use DDD and try to, of course, boil down to strategic design, tactical design, and having everything very clear, this talk is going to be was going to be 2 hours of it. It's not my intention. I just boiled down the summary of the technical test in 3 lines, which is this one. That's the mouse, as you can see. And the summary is this. we want a video streaming process. From a variety of sources and formats, we are going to import information of videos, and via process, we are going to store their information in a kernel also. I mean, it sounds fair, sounds rather correct. It's kind of hard to boil down implementation of DDD here, but I wanted to show off a bit. I thought it was worth the chance to rethink the test, rethink my implementation, and just going on. Yeah, went out of batteries. Oh, okay. Do I need to use the laptop now? Oh, okay. Just me pressing incorrect button. Then, I suppose that you guys got to me more or less about problem space versus solution space. It's something that went on the talk of Daniel Soler. From my point of view, from what I learned, from what I interpret this past year and a half, problem space means the inquiry or the problem itself that either an employer, an NGO, or yourself you need to solve in a way, and the solution space, it's just the implementation. It can be in any language, but overall, it's just the approach that you give to a problem. So, my approach to this, onto a technical test, was to extract bits of their explanation to understand implicit language. And I'm going to point this thing about implicit language because we are talking about ubiquitous language, and that's somehow a fancy word about DDD. I mean, ubiquitous language is something, from my point of view, that you learn throughout time when you work for an employer. It's something that you are rather aware of when you have maybe some time in the company, not to just become a business expert, but just to know what maybe customer means or what maybe order means or car means. Implicit language in this case means trying to guess by single words that I highlighted parts of the language that they use to describe the problem, to guess their entities or their terms that they might be expecting me to use when in case working with them. Well, I'm just picking up these kind of things, just store them for later and go on. Of course, that's not enough. I mean, video streaming, I'm just a very shallow backend PHP developer. How they expect me to do video streaming? It's going to be streams of data, it's going to be files, it's going to be concurrent. Do they want efficiency? Do they want clearness on the code? Do they want ubiquitous language itself? I mean, sometimes we just don't know. And when working with our employer, sometimes we find ourselves, the employer or business, asking us a problem that we don't understand, and sometimes we find employers asking us problems that even business doesn't understand. And sometimes, and this is just a learning that I stumbled upon very recently, sometimes we, as developers, are expected to work on the domain problem, but rather thinking that we need to discover the domain even more than the employer. So when it comes to shaping ubiquitous language, when it comes to rather developing a solution, we need to be aware that we might be programming something that is not the same, that has not the same conceptual integrity as in business. So we need to work out and ask to business and try to have a common solution or a common concept about the solution. For the technical test, it wasn't like that. So, I mean, I can ask them what a video means, what concurrently processing means to them. So I try to get or to reach a primary conclusion, which was up to me to work on their domain, which means just having some things in mind that would help me to have a rather close implementation. So these are just the words that I pick up from the text on the previous slides. I just thought about videos in a variety of writers and formats, the import concept, and and the internal store content. I mean, from that point on, I was thinking about how to reflect that on code, but instead just trying to work out what those terms would mean to me and what those terms would mean to them when just haven't the time to having me showing them the test. And I came up with something like this. Seems a little bit complex, but for me, since it was a test and I had a short amount of time to do the test, I thought about the fact that there might be providers that might be having videos even disguised as files. And you say maybe, why would you have a JSON file which is not a video file? Why would you have a YAML file as a video file or even a TXT file? In this case, I have thought about this as a list of videos which come in a different format. And remember that with that, more or less, I rather respect their definition on videos in a variety of providers and formats. From that, I'm going to have a process which is going to be importing them. Important here, since the endpoint is just a common one, in the process to have a common interface for those two specific and maybe a third one, so there's some transforming there. And eventually, once I have a common interface defined for all of them, and also rather transforming something into the domain or something into the business, just having them stored via a persistent mechanism, which can be a repository, can be a direct query into the database. Let's work on out the data. So, time a bit to work about the implementation that I thought. And after thinking a bit and trying not to do 20 bounded contracts and do SQL REST and sourcing and things like that, I just gave a very simple approach for that, which is eventually this one. My idea, I'm going to use my hands and pointer quite a lot here, was to issue a command, which can be a console command, can be a message, can be whatever, that might notice to business or the core bounded context itself to process a bunch of files which might be outside. Then in the domain, we are going to have the business logic, how to process one format, how to process another format. And then in the infrastructure, we are going to have the tools, the framework, the intrinsics, and the specific on how to import a YAML file and how to import a JSON file. And just the same way and with the same slice, having them stored via maybe a repository pattern in an external store that we may implement. Again, this is just an example or an explanation which explains a bit the three-layer architecture. I just suppose that you guys are familiar. There's something that are... Did we talk about this? I don't think so. Well, just to sum it up, domain contains all the business logic, which means something that is not related to the framework, something that maybe domain experts and not developers could read and understand the flow and their intrinsics of their business. And in the infrastructure, we would have, for example, Symfony framework, we would have tools, we would have Rust, we would have Erlang, we would have PHP, whatever. And in the application layer, it's as the more or less the arrow depicts here, sorry for being blue, the entry point for the use cases, for the comments, and then something in the application or even in the domain can access the comment handlers or the application services or domain services that would trigger or fire all the logic that's going to happen. Well, this is Shark kernel. You would say, I mean, in a very specific implementation, which is a technical test, why would you need a Shark kernel? I'm going to save that for later because I'm going to show parts of the implementation. I'm going to highlight a place where Shark kernel appears, and I'm going to. Then, important, this is a very specific slice of the implementation. There's nothing like how implementing the repository pattern, which tool I'm using. This is not the case. I more or less depicted the flow that I wanted to show, which is when a command happens somewhere around here, there's a request file into the application layer, so we can have a use case which we could pass, with which we could pass the provider name. With this use case, since the 3-layer architecture, it's going for that in that sense. Application would know things about the domain. Infrastructure would happen to know things about the application, but it's not going to happen all the way around. I mean, the sentido, the direction of the business logic and the bounded context is going to be like that. This use case would have knowledge about the domain service, which is called import video service, and this service would implement two more services. One is get import method from provider name, which is a service which is going to decide this is the kind of video that I want to process, then this is the instance of the object or the real process that it's going to implement. And then this interface, which is just something that's recovered from the import method from provider name, it's the thing that is going to really implement this solution. I mean, from the interface, we go straight ahead to the infrastructure when we have a message data transformer, since this is just transforming to a message, because it happens to pass from layer to layer. There's a video repository interface. Remember about the repository pattern or persistent mechanisms that I applied earlier. And build video service. The flow of things are from the service interface, we are going to receive a message. That message is going to be transferred on something which is not from the domain, which is collected onto the infrastructure. Then we are going to build the video aggregate or entity service from the terms of the message, and then we are going to store the video via a repository interface. So these are a bit of code examples. This is just from the application layer, the import videos from provider use case. Just don't get into intrinsics, it's just PHP. I just capture snippets of the code that were rather clear and for you to understand. As I said, application layer, the only thing that it's going to know is the service from domain that's going to be implemented on domain about importing the videos. And just to stop a thing here, remember the thing that I said earlier about shared kernel? If you see there are some uses or some dependencies about how I direct the information about the comments directly into the use case, since I thought more or less the way that I'm approaching the problem is not really a problem of the domain or the bounded context, I might better place everything that's related on my approach to the problem and not the real intrinsics of the business logic to be placed upon shared kernel as interfaces. They can be disguised as interfaces or even dependencies from third-party providers, which can happen. And more or less, for me, that's the use case for the shared kernel on a technical test. And well, I execute or handle the petition that I have from the command via this, and the only thing that I do is call the service with the provider name and have a response sent to it when it ends. This is the service. I'm not going to get into details. There are just a slew of dependencies, Delta parameters that I'm going to pass. I have more or less the capability to process them at once depending on the message that I receive from the command, or even just import a specific one from the provider name. And here's the part where rather all the magic happens. I have get the import method from provider name. I just mount an object which is rather not relevant to the domain, so it's as agnostic as possible, so there's nothing leaking from the domain into the infrastructure. And from that point on, I just mount some messages, and from that point on, sorry, I'm going to just close this. And then I just go into the process video service, which is just a service that is going to be on the next, not the other one slide. Yet again, it's not working. I'm so sorry. Thanks, Tim. Okay, does it work? Yeah. Okay, go ahead. This is the, well, yeah, the main service. This is kind of, and I wanted to show this because it's something that I'm going to show later on, very quick. This is the factory method with which I can know for this kind of video I'm having this implementation, from this kind of video I'm having this implementation. The only thing that this does is, depending on the parameter that I'm receiving, it builds the object or the container of the logic that is going to import the video, and then just return it. Again, this is really important. The process video service interface is the part where it, as you see more or less, guys, it's just an interface. You would say, why? It's because we are using intrinsics from the tools to import the video and transform it into other things. So this is just an interface that is implemented, very important, into the infrastructure. This is something which is a pattern that you might be against that, or which is really tricky, but it's something that helps that disguise, well, to shape things that can be disguised as domain services or domain concepts or terms, but they have dependencies on the tools, on repositories, or even messages and so on. So sometimes I see like that, we can discuss that later. That's the way that this process video service, which relies on infrastructure, holds the contract of process video interface. Again, these are just dependencies that are needed to process the videos. There's business messages. From that point on, I built again an object for the message. It's just for when information is being passed from layer to layer, just to don't have anything such as domain or infrastructure pass between layers. I just build the video aggregate from the information that I get, and after that I have the video aggregated built more or less properly. I just save it into a repository, whose implementation is not really important here. What do you think? It's great. Flawless victory. There's aggregates, there's domain services, there's application, there's infrastructure, there's domain. I think I pretty much got the job. I was really secure about my implementation, so I was really happy to hand over the test after this. And you can guess what happened after. They laughed at me, of course. I mean, yeah, right. It's just a very shallow implementation of DDD. There's some things that are really not really well processed, and that may be the reason why I didn't get the job. So, I mean, what's wrong? That's my rather exposure to DDD. That's what I learned. I mean, what's wrong? I might be doing things wrong, or it's time for me to rethink the design. It's time to me to reread the Buff and Veteran book implementing the range-driven design, or I mean, it's just time to discuss the errors of the implementations, which it seems it seemed for me quite obvious once I discussed with my former colleagues what I did wrong in the technical test, when I discussed with my potential employer what I did wrong, and so on. So, my first error for me was to use details from the infrastructure in domain and vice versa. I mean, as my experience tells me more or less, the three-layer architecture or the three-layer appliance onto the main problem or a technical test implies that each time that information or something is passed from layer to layer, there's no leakage from the main to the infrastructure, there's no leakage from application to the main, and to have those parts as isolated as possible. So, the example for this rather long implementation was in the factory method, which was held on the main, really important, using the Symfony dependency injector, which is held on the infrastructure layer, directly into the main to instantiate objects. That's that decision, rather. And of course, in the infrastructure service, in the process video service, which is the implementation from the main, I'm using an infrastructure object, which is advanced messages queue protocol message that has been built in domain, remember, to build the video, which is an aggregate, again, in infrastructure. I mean, I'm doing things that need to be done in the infrastructure, in the domain, and vice versa. I'm just leaking logic, and one after this implementation could see that there's business logic in the infrastructure layer and tools being used eventually on the domain layer, and that's wrong. So the fixings for that, from my point of view, would be just to don't use a factory pattern. Instead, maybe use a strategy pattern that will parse the info from the file as a domain service implemented in infrastructure, and this way, rather, we could avoid object creation using external dependencies. So, the only thing that we should need to do in this case is, given a method, we could just import the video via the provider name. And in the other example, which is held in the infrastructure, I mean, there's just no need maybe to build an object or an entity or a value object that's a message itself. The message value object or the message entity might mean something to business. So if it means something to business, when they say the word or they see the word message in domain, they might think about the term message as something from their domain or the problem space, and that's not the case. So instead of building the message to pass things from layer to layer, just pass plain parameters. That's it. I mean, when you have a domain service which might be implemented in infrastructure, instead of building a DTO or something really which might not be understandable for domain, just pass plain parameters that should be as clear as possible. For example, in the video, which I didn't explain, there are just three rather parameters which might be built upon, which are labels, name, and the URL of the video. And it's more simpler, at least for the domain, that each time that there's a video built, there's not a message being transformed, there's not a message being captured or disguised as a video, nothing like that. I mean, to build the video aggregate, I need the labels, name, and URL, and that's it. Error number 2. Of course, since I'm just learning DDD about 1.5 years, there's that kind of theories that you hear about aggregates, aggregate groups, event-driven architecture, and you tend to use that terminology really often, even when it might be wrong. So I would like to show the implementation of video itself and try to more or less think if it's an aggregate itself. I mean, it's really simple. It's something that can be created upon the label collection with a name and URL, and if those parameters are correct, then the video is returned with a new instance of itself. That's it. Again, this is just for the sake of using terminology. That might be bad. A possible fixing for that is that in their domain, more or less, the video itself is something that's being created. It's not something that's being transformed, and it's something that's not firing even events. It's something that's not being muted on the flow of the application. So the contrary of mutable means immutable. And what's immutable? Maybe about the object. It means that maybe a value object, which can be an object of domain, can be comprised about other value objects, and for me that's perfectly possible. And remember that in this wrong aggregate, the parameters that we need to create the video is level collection, which is just a collection of value objects, the name, which is just, again, a value object, and the URL. That's it. As the users more or less specify, they are value objects. A value object, of course, can be comprised of other value objects. There are a ton of examples that might be used for that. Again, maybe it's a value object, maybe not. Let's work on it. That's something that I rather work on about it later, earlier, sorry. I mean, what about the thing about messages? We were using messages just to pass maybe information from layer to layer. That might be wrong. That's really wrong. It's just because that we need a message, we are shaping this into our domain. So it's better for me to use it to pass information from maybe domain into the infrastructure or vice versa, which might be even more wrong. That's what it's called, from my point of view, a false invariant. A false invariant is something that's rather placed on the aggregates, which means this is something, well, it's a thing that we are developing inside the aggregates, and it's just out of our developer convenience, and it doesn't reflect something about the domain. In this case, this is rather a false invariant, because I'm using messages because it's convenient to me, and it doesn't reflect business logic. So a solution for that, of course, was maybe to pass in parameters. Well, I mean, that's it. That's what I told earlier. We don't need to use messages if they are not relevant to the domain. We don't need to use anything of the domain if it's not relevant to the guy that's maybe reading the test, or even to the business expert that's reading maybe my implementation of a problem. I mean, disregard maybe the messages and use quick manuals as whenever as possible. And again, that seems counterintuitive to something that I said earlier, but I mean, did I show something about shared kernel? It's not the case. I mean, what's the point for shared kernel bounded contents? Sims only has maybe interfaces as to how approach a problem, or as to how pass messages from layer to layer. I mean, using another bounded context just to reflect some part of the domain, or even to just let know the employer that you know what is, you're using it bad, it's quite bad. So, in the case of that we need shared kernel to exist, is that maybe because our persistence mechanism is complex enough to have their own big ball of logic or implementation, and we might be developing another bounded context for that. Let's imagine that we persist on various database engines. Let's imagine that we have Cassandra or even MySQL, and we need to store information concurrently or parallelly the same way, using maybe the same bounded context. In that case, shared kernel might have a chance to exist. But if it's not, if the only reason for the technical test to have a shared kernel is to show up, I mean, it's not really usable. It doesn't have a real reason to be there. So, I mean, shared kernel should not exist if there's nothing to share in this case. It'll be necessary in the case we need to integrate with another bounded context that might be created for a test if it applies. In my case, it really wasn't the case because I just had it was in a very short amount of time, and I just needed to show a bit of what I know about DDD. They didn't wanted to know about my knowledge of integrating bounded context, as I said earlier. So from that point on, shared kernel might be ceased to exist, and all those reasons might be the final reason why I didn't get the job earlier, and I ended up working for another employer. Learnings from that. Only reflect what's demanded in a test, and only use the terms they ask for. I mean, messages, services, and so on and on. I mean, if a business expert looks into the domain layer and only sees parts of their problem and not something that I invented upon, I mean, that test it's going to be good. Don't use complex messaging systems, and our context mappings is not necessary. I mean, it's just okay to have just a core bounded context and other domain logic there. You know how to integrate bounded context, you know what context mappings are. There's no need to reflect everything on the test. There's no need to do a test of 3 weeks in 3 hours, because the result might be this. Important, and that's why it has in big letters, don't program what you can explain in business terms. And with that, I'm not requesting you guys to be business experts, but if you don't really have a clue about what you're acting upon in the domain, then try to give it another thing and try to give it another round on the head. But if you are not clear enough on that, and there's somebody that needs to understand their domain reading your code, just don't mess their heads. Don't let them entangle their domain with your understanding of a problem. Really simple. Don't over-architecture your test. Even when trying DDD, I mean, it's super simple. If there's just a bounded context of code, just work on it. And last but not least, it's more important your understanding of the main problem from the space rather than the implementation itself. And I want to be very poignant here about that. We need, after doing a technical test, of course, when we search for an employer, to explain the problem or the approach that we gave to a problem. If we fall upon complex implementations and we need to explain the whole concept of DDD, which might be more entangled than the employer's expectations, I mean, it might not be worth it. I mean, you need to do a technical test, you want to do it with DDD, okay, let's make it small, try to make it on time, and try to shape the domain or this test to reflect as many terms from the problem as possible. Otherwise, I mean, you might be falling into details with which the employer maybe is not really interested. Well, just thank you for the chance. Thanks to Daniel Soler for the chance to explain this thing about implementing tests with DDD. And of course, if you see bad things, of course, that are being done on the technical test, it's something that's on my GitHub. You can put a pull request or an issue telling this is really wrong. You need to get it on. That's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Do you have a picture of your domain model?
I might say not, because I did these slides really fast, and I'm really sorry for that, because I really had a short time to prepare my presentation. But if you get more or less into my GitHub profile, you can get more or less an idea of what I wanted to approach, and the more terms that I just have left outside the presentation, so you can more or less get a clue of what I tried to implement.
All right.
Any other guy? No? Pizza? Yeah. Okay, thank you.